Detta föredrag tillhandahålls av Theofil, som är en evangelikal teologiförening som verkar för en förnyad frimodighet över Kristus och Bibeln. För mer information om oss, besök www.theofil.nu.
I've been asked to talk in this first lecture about why Jesus' resurrection matters. That might at first sight seem a rather strange question. Anyone who has any idea of the Christian story knows the shape of it, that the resurrection is one of the key moments in it. And yet I suspect that many Christians in today's Western world, and certainly many non-Christians in today's Western world, do not have as sharp and clear an idea as they might do of why it in fact matters. I'm going to suggest that in fact the resurrection sits, as it were, at the intersection of cultures, both in the ancient world and in today's world, and that if we really understand what's going on with Jesus' resurrection, we will see not only some quite important things about the nature of Christian faith from the beginning, but also some very important things about the way in which Christian faith should be, as it were, confronting the world today. I will say a little about that at the end of this lecture, and then there will be considerably more in one or other of the lectures tomorrow. Of course, many of you know the text from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where Paul says, if the Messiah is not raised, your faith is futile and you are still in your sins. In other words, if there is no resurrection, if Jesus is not raised, then the whole of Christianity is based on a mistake. That seems very clear in 1 Corinthians 15, but it is often misunderstood because resurrection itself is misunderstood. However, it is obvious if you stop to think about it that Easter, the resurrection of Jesus, is absolutely central to the Christian faith. In my culture, and perhaps yours, I don't know, Christmas has displaced Easter as the primary Christian festival. People think of Christmas and carol services and all that happens around Christmas as the specifically big Christian festival, and then at Easter maybe people are on holiday, they may be aware that some people send cards to each other, some people give their children Easter eggs, chocolate eggs, and other little toys for Easter, but this is trivial in terms of our culture and society compared with Christmas. And so people often imagine that Christmas is what the Christian faith is really all about, and that Easter is a kind of a pleasant diversion 1/3 of the way through the year as you go around the cycle. However, if you look at the New Testament, you would get a totally different view, because if you were to take out the Christmas stories, you would lose Matthew and Luke chapters 1 and 2, but not a lot else. One verse in Galatians, a hint at the beginning of Romans, one or two little bits here and there, but basically very little is made of the birth of Jesus in the New Testament and then on into the Apostolic Fathers and the 2nd century Fathers. But if you imagine taking out the story of Easter and the fact of Jesus' resurrection, then the whole thing falls apart. Because if you didn't have the resurrection narratives at the end of the gospel stories, and I shall be talking about that particularly in the university this afternoon, if you didn't have those resurrection stories at the end, the gospel story as a whole would mean something quite different. You will be aware when you are reading a novel or a short story that what happens in the last bit determines how you will then understand the whole of the narrative. And sometimes in a short story particularly, the writer makes something happen at the very end which forces you to look back through the whole story and realize that you had not quite understood it, but now you see it with a new eye. That is obviously the case with detective novels, where the writer deliberately disguises what has actually happened until the denouement, when the detective finally names the murderer at the end. But certainly with the Gospels, if there were no resurrection stories, it would not simply be that the books were slightly shorter than they are at the moment. the whole story would mean something very different. And then when we come to Paul, of course, you could take, as I say, the hints of Jesus' birth out, a little verse here, a half a verse there, but if you tried to take the resurrection out, you would find that Paul's theology would crumble to dust in your hands. And book after book, Acts, 1 Peter, even Hebrews, some people have thought that the resurrection is not particularly important to Hebrews, but some recent scholars have argued very strongly that in fact it is presupposed and vital throughout. And resurrection, and the book of Revelation and so on, and Clement and Ignatius and so on through. Resurrection is hugely important in the early Christian world. But I suspect that if we were to ask many Christians today why the resurrection is important, they might not come up with the same answers that people in the first century might have come up with. For many Christians, the resurrection is important because it demonstrates that there is, after all, life after death. That has been a major question in the modern world, as it was for many people in the ancient world. Again, many folk in the last 200 years have a rather odd idea that before the modern period, everyone basically believed in some sort of superstition about life after death or whatever, and that it is only we, with our modern science, who have questioned that. And so many Christians believing in a life after death assume that that is one of the major questions that they must address, and that Jesus' resurrection helps them address it. The problem with that is multiple. Yes, there is a life after death, but Jesus' resurrection was not exactly the sort of life after death that people now regularly believe in. After all, Jesus was dead for a certain period, according to the story, from the middle of the afternoon on Good Friday to sometime on the morning of Easter Sunday. So his life after death was whatever he was, wherever he was, on Holy Saturday, between Good Friday and Easter. Easter, as I've said again and again, and it for some reason confuses people, Easter is not about life after death, it is about life after death. Would you like me to say that again? Easter is not about life after death, it is about life after death. In other words, right from the beginning, the word resurrection and the resurrection belief of the early Christians was not about a one-stage post-mortem reality, but about a two-stage post-mortem reality. And as I shall be saying tomorrow morning, sorry, I shall stop giving these foretastes of things, but I'm just aware that there is a sequence of lectures here. But in the Jewish world, and also in the pagan world, the word resurrection, the Greek word anastasis and its cognates, never referred to something, a state of being which would follow immediately upon death, but always referred to a new sort of bodily life after a time of being dead. When pagans discussed that, as from time to time they did, you can see it in Pliny, you can see it in Aeschylus, you can see it in Homer even. They know that resurrection means somebody who was dead for a period of time now being bodily alive again. The pagans, of course, all deny that. There is the one extraordinary story in one of the old dramas in which Hercules actually rescues Alcestis, the heroine of one of Sophocles' plays, from the dead. Euripides, sorry. Alcestis was dead and is brought back to life, but the story is clearly and is known to be a myth in the sense of, wouldn't it be wonderful if this sort of thing happened? Hercules actually defeats the monster called Death, but it's a nice fantasy which in fact nobody in the pagan world believed in. And many in the pagan world of antiquity, just like many in the secular world today, affirm that there is no life at all after death. the Epicureans in the ancient pagan world, and as far as we can tell, some at least of the Sadducees in the ancient Jewish world believed that when you die, that's it. Your body dissolves, your personality, if there is a soul, your soul, whatever you are, goes off into the elements of the rest of the universe. So, though many people in the ancient and modern world raised the question about life after death, that is not principally why resurrection matters. Most of Jesus' contemporaries believed in life after death anyway. Jesus' resurrection was not life after death, it was life after death, which would have been very confusing. And resurrection clearly had to do with an embodied reality, whereas when people today talk about life after death, they usually, at funerals and so on, are referring to somebody who they believe and hope is now somewhere much better, which we loosely call heaven. I have often said it, but I will say it again here. In the Bible, heaven is important, but it is not the end of the world. The point about resurrection is that, yes, maybe when we die, we go to be with Christ, says St. Paul, which is far better. Call it heaven if you like. 2 years ago, I had the great privilege and sorrow of presiding at my father's funeral. My father was a lifelong practicing Christian. It was a lovely funeral, as funerals go, but we made sure that the prayers and the readings and so on made it quite clear that where he was at the moment was with Christ, which is far better, but that there is a new world coming in which God will make new heavens and new earth, and then he and all God's faithful people will be raised from the dead to share in that new world. So when we ask people, why does the resurrection matter? If they say, because it proves life after death, the answer is, well, that's not a particularly bad conclusion, but it is not the specific reason why resurrection matters. For some other Christians, secondly, the resurrection matters because it is the greatest miracle of all, which shows the reality of God and maybe teaches us things about God, about Jesus. Now, yes, of course, from one point of view, the resurrection is indeed the most extraordinary of all the extraordinary stories which clustered around Jesus from the very beginning. It is the time when, if it happened, somebody somehow, God or some freak of nature, caused something to happen which everybody knew had never happened before, and all the people who told the story knew had not happened since. Because Jesus' resurrection was, and the stories make this clear, qualitatively different from the raisings to life of other people. Jesus raised Lazarus to life. Jesus raised the daughter of Jairus. He raised the son of a widow at Nain. And back in the Old Testament, Elijah and Elisha both bring back to life people who had died. But the difference is quite clear. Yes, those are, if you like, miracles, but they are miracles about somebody coming back into this life again, so that they reassume the same sort of life and will one day have to die a second time. But from the very beginning, it was clear that the resurrection of Jesus was a different sort of thing, because Jesus had gone not into death and back again, but into death and somehow on, through, and out the other side into a new sort of life. That, at least, is what the stories seem to be saying. So is that a miracle? Well, yes and no. The word miracle has been a problem in our culture. I shall say more about this in a minute, but ever since the Enlightenment in the Western world, people have assumed a worldview in which God is a long way away and does not normally intervene in the world. Indeed, for many thinkers, including many would-be Christian thinkers, even to imagine God's intervention would be a category mistake. When I was first studying theology, some of the teachers in the university where I was were quite clear on that point, that God would not intervene in the world because that would be a nonsense of some sort. The problem with that is that then Christians have often responded and said, but God does do miracles, but they have affirmed that within the same framework of a normally absent God who sometimes reaches in and does strange things and then goes away again. But that is not the biblical picture of God and the world. The biblical picture of God and the world, from Genesis right on through, is focused in Judaism on the temple. And the temple was, for the Jews, the place where heaven and earth met and overlapped and interlocked. Heaven and earth were not separated from one another. That is the philosophy called Epicureanism, or the modern version of it we have called deism. But in the Bible, heaven and earth, God's space and our space, if you like, were supposed to work together, to mesh together. No doubt that is a very strange idea. No doubt if it's true, it will take a lot of working out and is quite difficult actually to live with. But if the word miracle suggests to you a cosmology with a God who is a long way away and only occasionally reaches down to act in the world, then even if you affirm the word miracle, you are in danger of affirming the wrong view of God and the world. So that's the second problem. If people say the resurrection matters because it is the great miracle, fine, but if by that they are simply leaving intact a model of the universe in which God and the world are separate, then that has to be challenged. At perhaps a more trivial level, but it's still important, I sometimes find, thirdly, that when people say the resurrection matters, it's because for them it matters to prove the truth of the Bible. Now, the word truth is itself contested in our day, and I'm not going to get into that subject just at the moment, so you can ask me about it if you like. I do have myself a high view of Scripture, that there is something very odd about saying that the importance of the resurrection is that it proves the Bible to be true, as though that were the ultimate goal of a theological enterprise, when surely the point about the Bible is that that's the book through which we discover the truth of other things. In other words, to say the resurrection matters because it somehow demonstrates the truth of Scripture is maybe to exhibit a nervous sort of Protestantism in which we want to cling onto and shore up the Bible because the authority of the Bible has had a particularly powerful and important and valuable symbolic role in many of our churches for many hundreds of years. So it seems to me that that is putting things the wrong way round. Fourthly, and finally, in these what I think are wrong reasons, for many people, the resurrection is important because it proves the divinity of Jesus. And since the divinity of Jesus has been, from the very beginning, central to Orthodox mainstream Christianity, people have said, well, there you are, God raised Jesus from the dead, so that proves that he's divine. Now, again, it both does and doesn't. And there is a danger in saying it like that. The divinity of Jesus, in which I very firmly believe, does not mean quite what many people in the modern world, including many Christians, suppose. Because again, if you start with a view of God, which is the deist or Epicurean view of God, and then you say, do you or don't you believe in the divinity of Jesus, what you sometimes end up with is Jesus as somebody from totally outside, Jesus as this miraculous, strange, angelic figure floating around with his feet not really touching the ground, and so that though he only seemed to be human, etc., he wasn't really. That is a problem, actually, a heresy which goes right back to the second generation of the church, Docetism, the idea that he only seemed to be human, but wasn't really. And there are many modern Christians, I fear, who fall into that trap because their cosmology, their view of God and the world, forces them into it, and they don't realize that it is the cosmology itself that needs to be challenged. In fact, the connection between the resurrection of Jesus and his divinity is much more subtle than that. I shall be talking about that later today and then a bit tomorrow. But look at it like this. Supposing 3 days after they were crucified, Jesus and these two brigands who were crucified along with him, supposing one or other of those brigands had been found to be thoroughly bodily alive again after a couple of days of being very thoroughly dead, would people have said that that person was then divine, the second person of the Trinity, the Saviour of the world? Pretty certainly not. What the resurrection demonstrates about Jesus, first and foremost, is something which was at least implicit in his life before he was crucified. Resurrection by itself doesn't demonstrate that. Just like when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, even though, as I say, that was a different sort of event, nobody said, "Oh my goodness, he's back from the dead, he must be the Son of God," or anything like that. So, though the resurrection does affirm something about who Jesus was beforehand, it doesn't simply and straightforwardly mean resurrection, therefore divinity. We will come back to that. Now, those are 4 ways in which many traditional Christians in my day, my culture, and perhaps yours, would say that the resurrection matters. And I've suggested that each of them has problems attached to it. There are ways in which skeptical or radical scholars have still tried to say that the resurrection matters, and let me just mention 1 or 2 things about that. For many radical scholars, and I'm thinking of the whole tradition not only from Rudolf Bultmann on, but in Catholic thought through people like Skilebek's, and actually back in liberal Protestant thought through people like Ferdinand Christian Bauer in Tübingen in the 19th century, but on also in my country to actually the former Bishop of Durham, David Jenkins, or to radical scholars in America like Dominic Crossan. For them, resurrection is to be reaffirmed as a symbol that Jesus' kingdom work continues. And they have tried, some of them, to argue that yes, resurrection is important, but it doesn't mean anything happening to Jesus' body. It's a metaphorical way of talking about the fact that Jesus' kingdom project lives on. Now, it's quite clear that in the early church, Jesus' kingdom project did live on. They went on talking about and trying to live out the message of the kingdom which Jesus had proclaimed. But they would all say, if we read the texts, that that's not because resurrection was a metaphor, but because something actually happened. Likewise, people have said, Skilebek says this in particular, that the early disciples believed that somehow, even though Jesus was dead, God was still with them, and, Skilebek's added, that God had forgiven them for abandoning Jesus. And, says Skilebek, it was that sense of God's surprising presence with them and of God's forgiving love for them, it was that sense which they then turned into strange stories about Jesus being raised from the dead, and that therefore, of course, it mattered. Some people, my friend and colleague Marcus Borg in Oregon in the United States, we've written a book together and we've often debated this and other topics together. Marcus Borg says that the resurrection means that Jesus is alive today and that he is a presence and a figure who individuals can get to know. But Borg says this did not involve his body being raised from the tomb. He says that that is a category mistake. He and I have had this debate many times, we know the moves and so on. Again, the early church was very clear. Yes, Jesus is alive, and yes, he is someone who can be present, powerfully, transformatively present in and to the lives of individuals and communities. But again, the early church said that though that is important, that's not the full or right or final importance of the resurrection. And that translates into another way that people have said that resurrection is really about the transformation of our lives. An English theologian called Harry Williams wrote a book called True Resurrection, a generation ago, in which he rather put to one side the question of whether anything happened on the first Easter morning, because he said the true resurrection, which really matters, is the transformation of individuals and of communities into being a different sort of people, holy people, witnessing people, loving people, humble people, etc. Now, I want to say, being holy, being spiritual, being prayerful, being loving, being wise, all of those things matter enormously, and yes, the New Testament connects them to the resurrection of Jesus, but they too are not the reason why the resurrection really matters. What then is the reason? Let's be quite clear once more that the meaning of the word resurrection in the first century was not vague or abstract. It was not about life after death. It specifically was not a way of talking about somebody having physically died but their soul now being somewhere else. It was a way really of cutting across that sort of idea, which was very popular and widespread in the ancient world as it is in the modern. I was saying to somebody in the car yesterday, I came upon a book, a coffee table book, a nice illustrated, sort of cheerfully presented book about the meanings and habits of death in different cultures. I'm not sure that one really wants a coffee table book about death, but it was a well-presented thing. And in this book, which was published very recently, I think in the late 1990s in the UK, the writer came to Christian beliefs, along with lots of other different religious traditions, and he said that in the Christian tradition, people talked about resurrection and the resurrection of the body, but he said most Christian theologians today don't believe in that and prefer to talk about the immortality of the soul. The man in question was not a professional theologian or biblical scholar, but even so, it took my breath away to think that somebody could say so casually, well, of course, the Christians used to talk about resurrection, but actually most of them find that unhelpful or not relevant. After they died, it actually had to do with bodies coming back to life in some way or other. Actual physical presence after a time of being physically dead. If you affirm that of Jesus, as the great tradition has until the Enlightenment has muddled it up, including muddling many Christians up, why particularly does it matter? Here is the first and perhaps the greatest reason. It matters because creation matters. The first article of the Christian Creed is, I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. Unless you have the goodness of a good God making a good world as the foundation of your theology, then both Judaism and Christianity fall apart, as they have threatened to do at many times, particularly in the 2nd century and onwards, falling apart into some varieties of Gnosticism, that is, the vague, loose beliefs in which the present world of space, time and matter was made by a bad God, and that there is a good God who is calling you to escape this world of space, time and matter and go into a different kind of existence entirely. And as the beginning of that, this good God has secretly implanted within some people a spark of life, a different sort of life, which then must be allowed to flower fully until the day when we leave this world behind altogether. Sadly, many modern Christians have embraced various varieties of Gnosticism, often without realizing it, and have imagined that that is actually Christianity. But it isn't. Christianity is based on the good creation and on the fact that in and through Jesus, the one God has reaffirmed the goodness of creation. The resurrection matters first and foremost because it is God saying yes to creation despite everything that evil and death and corruption and decay can do. And that is ultimately the good news of the gospel. God's yes to his own creation as a result not of ignoring evil and sin and death, but of dealing with them. We'll come back to that. You can see that, by the way, in various passages in the New Testament, though it's interesting that in the post-Enlightenment world, the Church has often not been quite sure what to do with them. Take Romans chapter 8, for example. I've spent half my adult life reading Romans, and Romans 8 is one of my all-time favourite texts from any culture, from any point of history. It's an amazing chapter. But the climax of that chapter, in verses 18 to 26, is all about the ultimate renewal of the created order. God will set free his whole creation from its present slavery to corruption and decay, what we loosely call entropy, to obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. That's really where the whole argument of Romans to that point is going. If you look at many commentaries on Romans, those commentaries will be quite detailed up to about verse 17 of Romans 8, and then they will often skip rather quickly over the bit about renewal of creation, because that isn't actually how many Western Christians have seen the doctrine of salvation. We have colluded with the view that salvation is from the world rather than for the world. For Paul, however, it is certainly for the world. You see that as well in 1 Corinthians 15 and elsewhere, where God will finally abolish death itself. Think about what that means, so that God will be all in all. Come back to the abolition of death in a moment. You see it as well, John chapter 20, verse 1. On the first day of the week, very early. I'll say more about this later, but in John you have a scheme whereby Jesus dies on the Friday, the 6th day of the week. On the 7th day, of course, God rests in the tomb, because that's what God does on the 7th day. And then on the first day of the week, very early. If we are reading John properly, we should know this is the 8th day. This is the beginning of new creation. That's what the stories are all about. But along with new creation, there goes also the theme of new covenant. The ancient Jews of Jesus' day, many of them anyway, and of course all generalizations about whole swathes of people like this are very dangerous, as though one were to say all British people or all Swedish people today believe that, and you could easily find some counterexamples. But many Jews of Jesus' day, for whom we have evidence, believed that they were living in a great long narrative which had yet to come to its proper resolution. The narrative was particularly focused on exile. They had gone to Babylon 500 years nearly before, but for many of them, though some of them at least had come back from Babylon, the real exile, which was a theological state, if you like, was not yet over. You can see this in the so-called post-exilic books of Ezra and Nehemiah, where both of them complain that we are slaves in our own land. And slaves, of course, for a Jew need a new exodus, a new rescue from slavery. What's the point in coming back from Babylon if we are still ruled over by the Persians, then the Greeks, then the Egyptians, then the Syrians, and now in Jesus' day, the Romans? We are still, in that sense, in exile. Not a geographical exile, but a state of being where we are not the free people of God we should be. And they particularly highlight Daniel chapter 9, in which the prophet Daniel, whenever you think the book of Daniel was written, this is certainly how it was being read in Jesus' time, the prophet Daniel asks God in prayer how long the exile is going to last for, because Jeremiah had said it would last 70 years. An angel comes and gives Daniel the welcome and the unwelcome answer, the good news and the bad news. The good news is, yes, the exile will finally be dealt with, but the bad news is it won't be 70 years, it will be 70 weeks of years. In other words, 70 times 7 years. That's towards the end of Daniel 9. And there were lots of people in Jesus' day. We can see it in Qumran, we can see it in the book of Jubilees, we can see it in some of the later rabbis, There were lots of people in Jesus' day who were calculating when that 490-year period would be over. And the real return from exile, the real rescue, the real redemption would actually take place. What would it look like? How would you know? Well, one of the signs of that, very prominently in the book of Ezekiel, was the resurrection. In Ezekiel chapter 37, which is all about the return from exile, the prophet uses the image of dry bones, dead and gone, which then are called to stand up on their feet, which are clothed with sinews and flesh and skin, and then which are given breath, and they come to life. And it's clear that this is, at the time, a vivid metaphor of the real return from exile. So, when Jesus of Nazareth, they said, was raised from the dead, one of the most obvious meanings for a first century Jew would be that this really was, in a strange sense, the return from exile, the renewal of the covenant for which they had waited. The two go together. Creation and covenant are bound up together in the Old Testament. New creation and new covenant go closely together in the New Testament. And please note, by itself, the crucifixion of a would-be Messiah would not at all mean new covenant, let alone new creation. Retrospectively, the Christians gave to Jesus' crucifixion all sorts of meanings to do with God forgiving sin, God rescuing people from death as well as sin, the final sacrifice through which people would be cleansed and restored, and so on. Without the resurrection, the crucifixion would not and could not have meant any of that. There were rather a lot of young Jewish men crucified in the first century, including some would-be prophets, leaders, even would-be messiahs. In no case did anybody say, after their death, that that was actually the redemptive event through which God was now doing a new thing. Sometimes in the Maccabean literature we get the hint that sometimes the death of the martyrs may have some kind of redemptive value, but not the decisive, one-off, return from exile sort of redemption for which they were waiting. So first, resurrection matters because it means new creation has begun. Second, resurrection matters because it means the new covenant has been launched. And there's all sorts of theological exploration of that we could get into. But thirdly, and nested within that, resurrection matters because it shows that forgiveness has happened. That's quite an important point to note. Forgiveness is not just something which happens to individuals when they repent and believe, though that is hugely important and central to anyone's ordinary Christian life. But as Paul says, back to where we started, if the Messiah is not raised, your faith is futile and you are still in your sins. But in fact the Messiah has been raised, which shows, and this is the point of what Paul was saying, that the cross was a victory, not a defeat. Something had happened, an event had occurred. So the resurrection matters because it gives this decisive interpretation to the cross. Not just that the cross opens the possibility of forgiveness for anyone who will believe it, though that's true as well, but that the cross has done something through which the power of sin and death has been decisively broken. And if you say to me, which you might well, that if you walk up and down the street and read the newspaper and look at the television, it doesn't look as though the power of sin and death has been decisively broken, my answer would be that the early Christians knew about the continuing state of the world just as well as we do, and probably a lot better, because life was very messy and very public for them. But they went on affirming nonetheless that in Jesus' death and resurrection, the one God had done something which meant that from now on the power of sin and death was no longer what it had once been. So this leads then naturally to the next point that matters. Resurrection matters because of creation and new creation, because of return from exile and new covenant, because it means that forgiveness is now, if you like, a cosmic reality, and therefore that death has been shown up both as an enemy and as a defeated enemy. It's very interesting in some scholarly writing that I've ploughed through about belief in resurrection. People have sometimes talked quite openly about, say, the books of the Maccabees or the New Testament, interpreting death as resurrection. That is simply a lie. They were not interpreting death as resurrection. Resurrection is not a fancy way of talking about death. The point of resurrection is the declaration that death has been dealt with. One of our great poets in the English language, John Donne, sometime Dean of St. Paul's in the early 17th century, wrote famous poems, sonnets called the Holy Sonnets, and one of them is about death, and it begins, "Death, be not proud." He's wagging his finger at death and saying, "You think you're so high and mighty, but actually you've been defeated." And the last line of the poem, last two lines are, "One short sleep past, we wake eternally." There's the life after death. "One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die." Wonderful poem. I commend it to you. I don't know if it's translatable into other languages, let alone if you can translate it into Swedish, but read it in English anyway. But that's the point of 1 Corinthians 15 particularly, that the resurrection, precisely because it involves the thing that death is all about, which is the decay and corruption and de-physicalization of this person, involves that being dealt with, reversed, and more than reversed, with somebody going on through into a new sort of life, which is now beyond the reach of death. As I said, Lazarus and the others had to die again. You know, one might think how wonderful for Lazarus to be raised from the dead, and no doubt it was, but the poor chap had to go through the whole process again. Death is therefore to be recognized as an enemy, not as a gentle friend. There are some hymns which have talked about, there's a great hymn of St. Francis which has the line, "And thou, most dear and kindly death, waiting to hush our latest breath. Alleluia." Now, let me say, pastorally, that's in the hymn. Most hymn books today miss it out, but it is there in the original. Let me say, pastorally, there are many times and many cases when people are old or sick, when death does appear as a sigh of relief. That's why in our day we have the big debates, certainly in my country, about whether you call it euthanasia or assisted suicide or whatever, because there are many people for whom life has become completely unbearable, so that when they then finally die, their family will say, however sad they are, it was a merciful release. Yes, that is true. God uses even this enemy in his service as a tool of his mercy. But let's not get too romantic, as it were, about it. Death remains an enemy because it remains the denial of the goodness of something which has been there in the created order. A human death is the dissolution of an image-bearing creature. That can never be other than a sorrowful, tragic horror. And resurrection matters because it is the defeat of that. Then fifthly, resurrection matters because it gives us the true shape of Christian hope. Back to where we were earlier on, life after death. I've been lecturing about the resurrection now for many years and writing about it and preaching about it. And the default position of so many Westerners, both in the church and outside it, is so strong that they see this idea for a minute and then they lapse back again. And often in the questions after a lecture on resurrection, people will look slightly puzzled and ask questions like, will there be pets in heaven, and things like that. And animals are important, but The question shows that people are still thinking that I must really have been talking about going to heaven. And I'm really not. So I say, heaven is important, but it's not the ultimate destiny. It's not the end of the world. It's what we have in the New Testament. Think of the last great scene in the New Testament, Revelation 21 and 22. I once went to a performance of Verdi's Requiem. You probably know Verdi's wonderful Requiem. And this was a special performance because it was being staged by a ballet company as well as by singers. And we had these people on stage who were acting out what the music was saying. And in one of the wonderful bits of Requiem towards the end, the singers, as they were singing this lovely music, were each given candles and were walking slowly up ladders on either side of the stage, and they all ended up upstairs with their candles singing Requiem aeternam dona eis Domine, rest eternal give them, O Lord. And it was this wonderful picture, which is exactly what so much of Western culture has said of death being the moment when you get your candle and you go upstairs and there you'll be safe and happy forever and ever. There was a twist in the way they produced it which made it more interesting than that, but I won't, and that's another point. The last scene in the Bible is not about that at all. It is about the New Jerusalem coming down from heaven to earth so that the dwelling of God is with humans, because it is about a new heaven and a new earth, and those two being not two but one. That is why the description of the city in Revelation 21, when you look at it in its Old Testament background, is the description of an enormous Holy of Holies within, as it were, an enormous temple, this great cube. It's borrowed from temple descriptions. Therefore, there is no temple in the city because the whole city is the holy place where the living God and humans dwell together at last. It's very difficult to get that across in our culture, partly because the hymns, as even that lovely one we sang, tend to get it wrong. Many, many hymns in my culture, many which I love dearly, end up with people going off upstairs to heaven at the end, rather than with the new creation. Oh, some of them get it right, and I look forward to more being written which will do that. But this actually affects how we do funerals, it affects how we think about our burial practices, it affects all sorts of things. It actually affects the way that you do grief. Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 4, I do not want you to grieve like those who have no hope. He doesn't say, I don't want you to grieve. He says, I don't want hopeless grieving. But if the hope is simply for a disembodied immortality, in which there is all sorts of medieval imagery about clouds and harps and angels, but which for most people today doesn't really resonate terribly helpfully, then that's not nearly as easy to grieve, hopefully, as it is if you have a robust belief in new heavens and a new earth. And though the early church quickly realized, because many of the early martyrs were burnt to death, were burnt to ashes, quite deliberately, in order to try to disprove resurrection, the early church realized that not having a body anymore of any sort, no bones nor nothing, and to have had the ashes scattered into a river, that didn't stop the belief that God could give people a new body. Though they did come to that view, so there's nothing wrong in that sense with cremation. Nevertheless, in my culture at least, the way cremation is now thought of and spoken of regularly reflects a kind of fuzzy romantic Buddhism rather than anything robust and Christian. And so you hear what I'm saying, that I think the way that misunderstandings about life after death have occurred in our society have allowed all sorts of things to happen and to be assumed, which in fact have nothing whatever to do with Christianity itself. And then, and perhaps this ties in with the other things I've been saying, theologically, resurrection matters because it is the point where the two great affirmations about God meet. And this was so in the early church fathers, and it was so in the early rabbis, interestingly as well. Not only creation, but judgment. come together in resurrection. And judgment in this sense, not in the sense of God being just angry with everybody and determined to smash everybody into little pieces. Rather the sense of judgment we find in the Psalms, like Psalm 96 and 98, where the whole creation will celebrate because God is coming to judge the world. What does that mean? The creation isn't celebrating because God's going to come and set it on fire and destroy it. No, God is coming to sort it all out. Judgment in Scripture is basically about God faced with a mess and a muddle and a chaos and wickedness, God doing things and saying things which bring order back to his world. That is judgment. And if you've ever lived anywhere, even for a short time, in which anarchy actually rules, you long for judgment like a thirsty person longs for a cold drink. You long for somebody to come and sort it out and make it clear how things are so that you can start and get on with real life. So if you believe in a good creator but don't believe in a coming sorting out of everything, then you may not believe in resurrection, because maybe the creator made a good world but now it's gone wrong and there's not much you can do about it. If you believe in judgment but not in a good creation, you can easily end up with some sort of Gnosticism, where if the creation was bad, then judgment will mean, let's get rid of this created order and our created bodies, and then we can go off somewhere else and everything will be better. But if you believe in creation and judgment, you will find yourself driven towards resurrection. And resurrection thus anchors this twin belief on which both Judaism and Christianity rest, and the resurrection of Jesus specifically, of course, anchors the belief on which Christianity rests. And finally, my last main point in this sequence, and then I've just got a conclusion before we go into questions in 5 or 10 minutes or so. Resurrection matters for the nature of the Christian mission. I'll come back to this tomorrow afternoon. Resurrection matters for the nature of the Christian mission. If we really believe both in Jesus' resurrection and in the future resurrection of all God's people, then the Christian mission can never be about simply saving souls from the wreck of the world. Often, yes, the wreck of the world is very clear, and the wreck of human beings is very clear, and people do need to be rescued from that, and that does involve an internal personal transformation, which one can describe in a variety of ways. All of that matters. Some people have imagined that if you go in the direction I'm going, you lose the importance of personal conversion or spirituality or personal future hope. You certainly don't. You rather contextualize it more firmly within its New Testament anchorage. But the point about the resurrection is both that there is a much more solid future hope to which people are called than we've realized, but that hope has already begun. The resurrection of Jesus means that something has happened in the created order as a result of which the world is now a different place. One of the most extraordinary verses anywhere in Paul is when he says in Colossians 1 that the gospel has already been preached to every creature under heaven. Now, Paul's only been on the road for 15 or 20 years by this stage, and he knows perfectly well that there are plenty of people, even in Ephesus, let alone in the wild lands beyond, to the north and the east, who haven't physically heard with their human ears the message about Jesus. But he doesn't even say the gospel's been preached to every human. He says it's been preached to every creature. What can that possibly mean? Well, from Colossians 1:15 through 20, that amazing poem which comes earlier in the chapter, we know that God, the one God of Jewish monotheism, made all things in and through and for the Messiah, Jesus Christ, and has reconciled all things in and through and for the Messiah, Jesus Christ. And it looks as though Colossians 1 is saying, in our language, that when Jesus was raised from the dead, a kind of cosmic shockwave went through creation, so that even though many human beings haven't yet heard this good news, there is a sense in which, when my students say there is a sense in which, I say, wait till you've figured out what the sense is and then tell me, because otherwise this becomes a way of just not thinking it through. But this is such a mysterious point that I think we simply have to say there is a sense in which the world is now a different place and knows in its bones that its creator has begun dramatically, decisively begun the work of its restoration. So when we find in John 20, in Matthew 28, in many other passages, the disciples commissioned by the risen Lord to go into all the world, as the Father sent me, so I send you, and so on and so on. There, we are not seeing people being asked to go and do a kind of mission impossible, persuading people that this strange young Jew who has just died and something's happened to him is in fact the Lord of the world, even though it doesn't make much sense. They go into a world which has already been summoned by its creator to give him its allegiance. Christian mission begins with the resurrection, because the resurrection of Jesus provides the ontological ground for the work of the church. That's why in the last generation in my country, it has been so tragic to see so many people who, for very good reasons, have devoted themselves to working with the poor, to working with the homeless, to working for justice in the third world, etc., but who have imagined that in order to give themselves to that task, they must sit lightly to doctrines like incarnation, atonement, and particularly resurrection, as though they were kind of escapist doctrines about a privatized personal salvation, which you had to park somewhere else in order to get on with the contemporary work of the church in the world. No, the resurrection is the foundation of the mission of the church to the world, because it is the very beginning of that transformation which God has promised will happen ultimately and will happen penultimately through the work of the church. And I will say more for conclusion. How and why and where this matters in terms of where we are in our Western culture. Again, the Enlightenment. And when I speak about the Enlightenment critically, let me be quite clear. I do not think the Enlightenment was an unmitigated disaster. To look no further, I am intending to get some dentistry done in my mouth in the next few weeks, and I would not like to be operated on by a pre-modern dentist, or a postmodern one for that matter. I want the full blessings of post-Enlightenment scientific modernity, thank you very much. But the Enlightenment took the fact, the undoubted fact, of amazing scientific advance, medical advance, technological advance. I mean, even those who don't know very much about history must realize that the last 200 or 300 years have seen utter transformation, whether it's mobile phones or putting a man on the moon or whatever. Extraordinary transformations have happened and are happening scientifically. But the Enlightenment narrative took that undoubted fact and turned it into something very different, a story about how we in the modern West had progressed in every other way as well, so that we had now got a kind of effortless superiority over the rest of the world, indeed a sort of exceptionalism. The present fad in some quarters for American exceptionalism is simply the sharp edge of the larger narrative of Enlightenment exceptionalism, where the nations of the Enlightenment have been encouraged, it's in our bloodstream, to look at the rest of the world rather pityingly, the third world we call it, or the second world, or whatever. And the result of that is that we have told a narrative in which world history reached its climax in the 18th century in Europe and America, and now we must simply implement all the wonderful progressive ideas and ideals that have been coming at us ever since. The trouble with that, from a Christian point of view, is that the Christian message is then downgraded to form one religion within that larger narrative. Indeed, calling Christianity a religion at all is a bit of an ambiguous thing. But within the Enlightenment world, oh yes, there's still a place for religion, because God is upstairs, we're downstairs, we now know how to run the world down here. This is how the story goes, with our technology and our new democracies and all the rest of it. And so we are going to create an earthly paradise, and if you want a heavenly paradise, then you can escape to the God upstairs in your private spirituality in the present, and your hope for a blissful, non-spatio-temporal immortality in the future. And many Christians and many churches have gone along for the ride, have colluded with that shrunken vision of the gospel, which leaves the church with no political critique, never mind anything else, with no real social agenda. And then when people do come up with a political critique or a social agenda, the Christians who are very keen on their relationship with this distant God say, you're missing the point, you're secularizing the gospel. The answer is that it's the Enlightenment which has split our world apart, and we ought to be heaven and earth people with the resurrection as the anchor of that. So the narratives of modernity offer an alternative eschatology to the narrative of the gospel. Modernity says world history reached its climax in Europe and America in the 18th century. The gospel says world history reached its climax when Jesus of Nazareth came out of the tomb on Easter morning. And if that seems counterintuitive, that is largely because we have been so soaked in that Enlightenment narrative that we instinctively lurch back to it, and then even often are tempted to say that Christianity has been part of the problem rather than part of the solution. Many people will tell us that even if we don't hear it in our own heads. Not to put too fine a point upon it, as the early Christians saw quite soon, if Jesus is raised from the dead and is the Messiah of Israel, he is the Lord of the world, and that means that Caesar is not, whoever Caesar may be, in the muddled world of post-Enlightenment. And particularly, if Jesus is raised from the dead, then the vision of Isaiah has started to come true, that under the rule of the Messiah will be a time of peace, which will end up with the earth being full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. The Enlightenment tries to get that vision and constantly fails, and then can't understand why it fails, and tells the same story again in the hope that it'll work this time. It's precisely what we've been doing with the Arab Spring. Yeah, we know the narrative, you get rid of those silly old tyrants, and then democracy and peace and love will automatically flourish. We are starting to realize that our narratives have let us down. That's because they were always a self-serving myth in the first place. It's time to put the resurrection back where it belongs, as the thing which matters, because it is the fulcrum of world history. I've spoken for too long, I'm sorry, but there is now time, maybe 20 minutes or so, is that right, for questions? So it might be a good idea, you've been sitting very patiently, but let's say, if you take a minute or two and turn to your neighbour and buzz for a bit and say what you've been puzzled about or what you found startling or heretical or whatever, and then we can take some questions in a minute. Who would like to ask a question? Yeah, somebody right at the back.
I'd like to start off by thanking you again for a great lecture. I heard you also in Örebro, as you perhaps remember, and also posed a question. You mentioned the coffee table book, or whatever you call it, that said Christianity's moved on from resurrection to general talking of the immortal soul. And this is my question. What would you say is the place of the talk of the immortal soul in the Christian faith? And I believe you've been asked that question before, because I have a vague notion of reading something about it, but I'd like to hear you sort of elaborate on that topic.
Thank you very much. Yes, good question. And people do often ask about this, especially in the context of bereavement and funerals. Is it appropriate, if we believe in the ultimate resurrection, is it appropriate to talk about the soul as the way in which this person is still somehow alive or whatever between bodily death and bodily resurrection? The first thing to say is that that is not basically how the New Testament uses the word soul. The word soul is a bit confusing in the New Testament because it's easy for us to read it in the light of Plato's vision of the soul, which is that souls are immortal, so that when somebody is conceived in the womb, a soul, an immortal soul, comes to dwell in them at some point, and that then after they've died, this immortal soul will continue. That belief is specifically contradicted in the New Testament, where it says that God only has immortality, and that immortality, if such there be, is God's gift rather than something which humans innately possess. That leads to all sorts of other questions. But then what we have to try to do is to see the way in which the language of the soul functions. I will say a little bit about this tomorrow actually, within the Jewish world where they did believe in resurrection. The clearest passage is the Wisdom of Solomon chapter 3, which, having in chapter 2 described how the righteous people have been persecuted by the wicked people to the point of death, it then says, the souls of the righteous are in the hand of God, and there shall no torment touch them. In the sight of the unwise they seemed to die, but they are at peace. So there, soul is a way of talking about the continuing personal reality in some mode or other, in the presence of God and in the safekeeping of God, of people who have died. The passage then goes on, and many people forget this, that at the time of their visitation they will shine forth and run like sparks through the stubble, and the Lord will set them over nations and kingdoms, and the wicked will see them and be horrified. These are the people that we killed, and they're back again. This is bad news for the wicked. So wisdom is offering a picture of resurrection, but in between bodily death and bodily resurrection, it uses the language of the soul, which is borrowed from either Platonism or Stoicism or both in the confusing world of the first century, as a way of talking about the fact that God is looking after God's people in between the one event and the other. I notice, however, that though some other Jewish texts do that as well, to Baruch, for instance, many do not, and that many use other languages like the language for angel or spirit. When Paul is on trial in Acts 23 before the Sanhedrin, Paul puts the cat among the pigeons by saying what this trial is all about is resurrection, and the Pharisees say this man may be perfectly all right, and they say, supposing an angel or a spirit spoke to him. What are they thinking? They are thinking that, well, of course, resurrection hasn't happened, but maybe somebody who was in between death and resurrection, who is in the form of an angel or spirit, appeared to Paul. So you have the use of the word soul to denote that intermediate reality, the use of the word angel, the use of the word spirit. And these seem to be signposts to something for which they did not have any other clear language. But let's be clear, despite what generations have said, Jews believed in resurrection, pagans believed in immortality, it's just not like that. If you believe in resurrection, you must believe in some kind of continuing existence. Even if you say that you are asleep during that period, as some theologians have, mistaking, I think, the biblical metaphor sleep for something as though that was more of a reality. So the word soul is quite a convenient word to use to describe the continuing existence in the presence and power and love of God between death and resurrection. But the danger for us is that if we use the word soul to denote that, we very easily slide into the Platonic belief that all humans automatically have an immortal soul come what may, which is specifically denied in the New Testament. Is that reasonably clear? Good, thank you. Next question. Yes. Somebody right at the front. Okay. And then there's the next one after that is at the back, so when we're done with that you can go, yeah.
Yes, right in the beginning of the lecture we talked about the temple being the meeting point of the heavenly and the bodily, so to speak. In a post-resurrection sense, would then Paul talking about us being the temple, would then every place, every person be that? Or are you talking about a full panentheism where everything is the meeting place of?
Nice question. Paul is quite clear in the temple language that he uses in 1 Corinthians 3 and 6 and 2 Corinthians 6, that both the individual Christian and the collective church is now the dwelling place of God. And many Western Christians for whom the temple is just a distant memory of a large strange building in Jerusalem, and they haven't really thought about the cosmology of it, think of that as just one ecclesial metaphor among others. For Paul the Pharisee, it could never be that. Paul knew perfectly well what the temple was and meant, and he really does mean, and actually it's not only those passages. In Colossians and in Romans and elsewhere, he uses the language of the indwelling spirit, the spirit which dwells within you. But that language of indwelling, in Greek oikin or en oikin, is language which is sometimes used in the Septuagint about the tabernacling presence of God dwelling in the temple. And likewise, when Jesus in the farewell discourses is talking about the Spirit, the language he's using of the one who dwells in you and will be in you is also, as you would expect in John, temple imagery. So this is why I would say that the Greek Orthodox, or the Orthodox churches in general, have hung on to something which the Western churches have often lost. If you really believe in the Holy Spirit, you must really believe in the living presence of the living God in each Christian and in the church as a whole. That, however, does not lead to panentheism. It's interesting, when Paul says that God will be all in all, that I think is picking up that image I quoted from Isaiah 11 or Habakkuk 2, that the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord, or in Habakkuk the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea, which is, as I've often said, a scary thought. How do the waters cover the sea? The waters are the sea. It is said, but this is not panentheism. It is what you might call theenpanism, God in all rather than all in God. But it is, here's a lovely technical phrase for you, translate this into Swedish if you dare. It is eschatological theenpanism.
One more time.
Eschatological theenpanism, i.e., at the end, God will be all in all. Look at it like this. In the Bible, God makes a world that is other than himself. Philosophically, that's scary, because if God is good, it means he's making a bad world, doesn't it? And some philosophers have thought that. But in the Bible, this is because God creates out of love, and love affirms the otherness of the beloved, even while it seeks appropriate union with the beloved. Thus, God makes a world that is other than God, loves a world into existence, in order that, without stopping the world being itself, he can appropriately come and fill it with himself. And I think that's what's going on in Romans 8 as well. So the temple image points to all of that, I think. Yeah, next question, right at the back there again.
Yes, you invited us to, or I heard the invitation, so please talk more about the topic of truth, and especially in academic setting as a doctoral student in theology, and when I have presented, for example, your epistemology of love to my professors, they think it's not a good standing point.
Fine. I would love to meet your professors and have that conversation with them. I mean, this is not my own central expertise, but I've thought quite a lot about it. And I've thought particularly about the notion of truth in John's Gospel, where it plays a striking role, as it does also in Paul, but in John it's very important. And it seems to me we have, as usual, got ourselves snagged on some problems in the Western world, because the Enlightenment particularly focused on, if you like, factual truth or scientific truth, the sort of truth that you can measure and assess with scientific methods, or indeed economic truth. In other words, how much money have I got in my bank, and you either have this money or you don't. And so truth simply as correspondence with reality on a one-for-one basis. However, most human beings who have used the language of truth down the years have used it in much more interesting ways than that, including relational truth and the truth about beauty. I know that the Romantic movement tended to align truth and beauty. Beauty is truth, truth, beauty, said Keats, wasn't it? That tends to collapse things, because then it becomes subjective. So that the first one becomes too objective. The truth is simply the way things are, and if you can't see it, you just haven't learned to do mathematics or whatever. And then truth as what is true for me. And this is the great divide between modernity and postmodernity. Modernity says it's just like that, get used to it, and we're just observers from a distance. And postmodernity says the only truth that matters is my truth. It's actually much easier to be a postmodernist if you're in a comfortable Western country. I don't think there are many postmodernists in Syria right now, because a lot of people who believe in their truth, but their truth is denied by bombs and bullets and barbed wire. So that's the puzzle of truth. And it seems to me rather we should explore with the New Testament a different sort of possibility, that precisely if we believe in new creation, if we believe in the resurrection, then the resurrection ultimately becomes the new epistemological starting point. And what that means is that there is a sort of correspondence, but the correspondence is with new creation. And this does not mean a private world, because it is precisely new creation. It is the renewal of creation. But because God's creation and then new creation are, yes, the objects of, or the results of, his love, and because our task is to be people in and for and of new creation, then when we speak words which bring about new creation, we are speaking truth, not because it corresponds in a static way to something which is, but because, as well as that, it actually brings into being the new reality which is God's reality. And that is the act of love. That when somebody makes wise judgments through which the world is healed, when somebody discovers a new chemical formula which enables some disease to be healed, they are bringing into being a bit of new creation. And it seems to me, therefore, the concept of truth has to be seen as a function of the vocation of humans in relation to new creation. That truth is something which happens when humans, reflecting God's wisdom into the world, speak God's creative word. Of course, the other sorts of truth, modern or postmodern, can find nesting places within that, and that's fine, but they're not places to stop. It seems to me the Christian vision goes on beyond, not to exclude those others, but to embrace them within a larger whole. I didn't know I was going to be asked an interesting question like that this morning. Thank you very much. Time for perhaps just one more. Is there one more question? If I exhausted you. Yeah, one in front here, thank you. And then I think we must.
Yes. I'm wondering how
we talk about the continuity between this earth and the new earth. I think Revelation 21 puts it that the old earth would be no more. Would you formulate it that we are now walking on this earth that will be walking in the future, or how would you put it?
Yes, that passage at the start of Revelation 21 has puzzled many people. I'm not an expert on the book of Revelation, but on precisely this question I've consulted good friends like Richard Borkham and Lawrence Luckenbrook and others who have spent their lives studying Revelation, and I'm assured that the best way of taking that text is to say not that God will abolish this world entirely and produce a new creatio ex nihilo, a creation out of nothing. The oldness which is to be destroyed is precisely the oldness of corruption and decay and so on. So that Revelation saying the old heaven and the old earth had passed away that is the world of corruption and decay, but it's another way of saying what Paul says in Romans 8, that creation will in fact be set free from its corruption to decay. And that's why resurrection matters in the book of Revelation as well, not that it's a totally new creation. It is not, say, creatio ex nihilo, it's a creatio ex vetere, a creation out of the old. This needs teasing out a lot more than I have time to do now, but that is the view that I and many others have taken. And that's why when we speak of continuity, it is always a mystery, but it is a mystery whose shape we recognize because it is the shape of the resurrection stories in the Gospels. That Jesus leaves an empty tomb behind him, and yet his body is strangely different. It can come and go through locked doors. It is not immediately recognized, and yet it is clearly him. And there is a mystery about that. And since that is the only solid example of the thing that we're talking about, it's difficult to go too far down the road of saying exactly how continuity and discontinuity will work, especially because, as I said, the resurrection belief from the beginning included the belief that if somebody's body had been totally burned and dissolved and thrown away to the winds, God would give them a body. And Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, God gives it a body. You may know, and that this is sort of relevant to that, Tertullian was asked a question about supposing a cannibal eats a Christian, and supposing then the cannibal converts and becomes a Christian. Then when the cannibal dies, in the resurrection, who will get which bits of this body? And actually, people ask the rabbis that sort of question as well. It's rather like the question they asked Jesus about the woman who had 7 husbands and so on. And Tertullian basically says, "Oh, do shut up and go away." There are better answers than that. Origen gave the answer, which I first met in C.S. Lewis, but it was there in Origen already, that our bodies are in any case in a state of flux. The complete molecular atomic kit of our bodies changes roughly every 7 years. It's not just fingernails and hair that fall off or cut off or whatever, that the whole thing is changing and is in a state of flux together with the rest of the physical world. And so, in other words, it's not a big deal to get the same molecules back. You trust that God will recreate the real you. Now, if God wants to use the bones that are lying in the churchyard to recreate that particular person, fine. But it's clear from early on in the Christian tradition that God doesn't have to do that. Therefore, continuity, yes. Discontinuity, yes. How they work together, we don't have any very clear models. But the critical thing is we must not allow the vision of new creation to make us dualists about the old one and say that therefore the old one doesn't matter. Because resurrection is the reaffirmation of the goodness of creation. It's time to pause. You're going to have lunch. I'm going to go somewhere else and have lunch. And I shall see you, God willing, this afternoon. Thank you.